Hello guys, today I'll be talking about 10 great rock/metal albums from the year 2003. And these albums are in no particular order, and this is not a top 10. These are 10 albums that I randomly selected that I feel are great from the year 2003. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to go ahead and start off with Evolver by 311. Kind of an underrated album at this point in their discography. It's not talked about as much as some of their other albums, like From Chaos or the Blue Album or Grassroots or even Transistor, but I think this album's pretty good, and to me, their last strong album, I'd say. And don't get me wrong, I like a lot of the stuff they came out with after the album. Mosaic, I'd say, is probably the best in terms of the albums that came out after this one, but yeah, I think this album is pretty good. You got Creatures for a while on here, which is probably the biggest song on here and definitely one of the highlights on the album. But you have other great songs like Crack the Code. You have Beyond the Gray Sky, which is a bit of a more melodic song, a bit of a slower song. You also have Don't Dwell, where you get some pretty solid bass work. And you also have Other Side of Things, which is a fairly straightforward, simple song, but at the same time, it's one of my personal favorites, and I think it's a pretty catchy song, and probably one of my personal favorites on the album. But overall, a pretty good album from 311. Next, we're going to go ahead and move on to something a bit heavier with this album, Frail Words Collapse by Azalea Dying. Definitely a metalcore classic. Some of my favorites on here, 94 Hours, definitely one of their best songs, I'd say. You have other great songs, or some of my other favorites like Forever, Distance is Darkness, which I think is kind of an underrated song, kind of a banger, I'd say. Behind Me Lies Another Fallen Soldier, Undefined are other great songs. And you also have another fan favorite on here, that song being Elegy. But yeah, pretty good album from Azalea Dying, and I'd say one of their best albums, maybe. Now let's go ahead and move on to some progressive metal with this album, Train of Thought by Dream Theater. Arguably, maybe their heaviest album, and it's one of my personal favorites from the band. Now, when it comes to what the fan base overall thinks of the album, the fan base seems kind of divided. Yeah, I've seen some people say that they really love it or really enjoy it, but you also have some other people that aren't really big on it. Some people call it even their new metal album, which I find kind of interesting, but for me, one of my personal favorites from Dream Theater, and I like how heavy it is. But some of my favorites on here, As I Am, which is maybe the biggest song on here. You have other great songs like Endless Sacrifice, and then you have Honor Thy Father, which is maybe my favorite song on here. I think the album closes in a strong manner with the song In the Name of God, but yeah, really good album from Dream Theater, I'd say. Probably top 5 Dream Theater album for me. Let's go ahead and move on to something a bit more mainstream with this album, Faceless by Godsmack. So yeah, easily my favorite Godsmack album. I mean, you do have some of their biggest songs on here, like Straight Out of Line and I Stand Alone. But you have other great songs like the title track, one of my favorites on here. You also have I Fucking Hate You and Releasing the Demons, which are other great songs on here. But yeah, maybe their heaviest album, but yeah, easily one of their best, I'd say, and probably, again, my favorite Godsmack album. But next we got Meteor by Linkin Park. I mean, if I'm going to talk about 2003, I kind of have to talk about this album. I mean, I don't know where my music taste would be without this album. Definitely an important album when it comes to, I don't know, my music journey, you could call it, but this is easily my favorite Linkin Park album, and also, honestly, one of my favorite albums of all time. I mean, you really can't go wrong with any of the songs on here. You do have variety, and yeah, some of my favorites on here. Honestly, it's kind of tough to pick favorites, but some of my favorites, Somewhere I Belong, of course. Hit the Floor is another personal favorite of mine. It's grown to be one of my favorites over time. You have other great songs like Figure .09. Honestly, all the singles on here are really good, but some of the lesser known songs are also great. Nobody's Listening, which is a bit more hip hop focused. I really like that song. And of course you have another big song on here like Breaking the Habit, which is easily one of my favorites on the album. But yeah, overall, a really good album from Linkin Park, and definitely one of the best albums to come from the new metal era. But next, we're going to go ahead and move on to an album that might be maybe a controversial pick, because when this album came out, it got a fairly divisive response from not just critics but also fans because of how different it was from their previous album. Their previous album being very big success for the band, and of course I'm talking about this album, Payable on Death by POD. So yeah, their previous album was Satellite, and that's probably maybe their biggest selling album. And with this album, the album's a bit darker. Of course, they have a new guitarist with this album. You have Jason Truby, if I got the name right. But yeah, the album, again, it's a bit darker. There's not as much hip-hop influence compared to some of their previous work, like Fundamental Elements of Southtown and Satellite. And I've heard an argument that I've seen more with critics rather than fans is that a lot of the songs kind of have similar structures, or they have a similar formula. But even if that's the case, I still think this album is pretty good. It definitely has a share of songs that I think are pretty overlooked, especially by the fan base. Freedom Fighters, maybe one of their most underrated songs, I'd say. I really like that song a lot. Maybe one of my favorite POD songs. But of course the singles on here are great. Will You and Change the World. Change the World maybe being my favorite of the singles and also one of my favorites on the album. But the deep cuts or less known songs on here I really enjoy, like The Reasons, and of course Freedom Fighters again. I Identify, Wildfire. I really dig this album, and this was an album that I didn't listen to a lot back in, I want to say middle school or early high school, around the time where I was getting into POD. I remember this being an album that I listened to it a lot, along with of course Satellite and Fundamental Elements of Southtown. But the album closes with a pretty interesting instrumental, that song being Eternal. And yeah, that song is fairly different from anything else they've done, but still a pretty cool instrumental, I'd say. But yeah, overall, an interesting album in their discography. Definitely an album that doesn't really sound like really anything else in their discography. Fairly unique album, I'd say. But yeah, if you haven't heard this album, definitely check it out, especially if you like new metal. The next album we're going to talk about, Seasons by Sevendust. And if I remember correctly, this was their last album with TVT Records. And yeah, I think this is one of their best. I mean, for some people might say that this album is a bit of a step down from Animosity. I mean, this album doesn't have as much variety as Animosity, and even if that's the case, I still think this album is pretty good, and again, one of their best, I'd say. But I think the first half is easily the stronger half, but the second half is not bad either. You do get some good stuff in the second half, like Suffocate and Face to Face, but I mean, you really can't go wrong with those first 7 songs especially. But yeah, Separate and Skeleton Song probably being some of their most underrated songs, but some of the bigger songs on here I think are still pretty good, like Enemy and Broken Down. But yeah, overall, really good album from Sevendust, I'd say. But next we have this album, Leave a Whisper by Shinedown. So yeah, this is one of my favorite Shinedown albums. But some of my favorites on here, Fly From the Inside, which is probably one of my favorite Shinedown albums at this point. I also enjoy Lost in the Crowd, No More Love. I think Stranger Inside and Crying Out are probably some of their most underrated songs. Crying Out maybe being one of my favorite Shinedown songs, honestly. But the hits on here are also, of course, pretty good. 45, Fly From the Inside. You also do have the cover of Simple Man, and I think the cover is okay. Vocally, there are moments in the song where I'm not sure if I'm feeling how Brent is delivering some of the lyrics, but besides that, overall, I think the cover is not bad. But yeah, I think you get some pretty good deep cuts in the album, I'd say. But yeah, overall, I think it's one of Shinedown's best. Next, we move on to Phenomenon by Thousand Foot Crutch. Now, I'll be honest, Thousand Foot Crutch is not a band that I listen to as much nowadays, at least compared to back in, like, I don't know, middle school and high school, but I still think this album is pretty good, and the songs are fairly straightforward and definitely has that nu metal flavor, you could say, and a lot of the songs are great. There isn't really much in terms of weak songs. If I had to choose, maybe Quicken is maybe the weakest song on here, but that's not really saying much because I still do like that song. But some of my favorites on here, I like the title track. Of course, you have the big song on here, Rock Fist, Faith, Love, and Happiness, maybe one of my favorite Thousand Foot Crutch songs. But yeah, you're moving towards the second half where you get some pretty underrated stuff, like the album closer, Break the Silence, easily one of my favorites on the album. You also have some fun tracks like Bounce. But yeah, overall, pretty good album from Thousand Foot Crutch, and maybe my favorite album by them. But while still, again, maybe not a band that I return to as much as I used to, I still think this album is pretty good. And whenever I return to certain songs on here, I still enjoy them. But next, we're going to go ahead and move on to the final album here for this video, and that is 3 Days Grace, the self-titled album, their self-titled debut. And I'll admit, I have a lot of nostalgia for this album. This was an album that I listened to a lot back in elementary school. So yeah, I was fairly young when I got into 3 Days Grace. They were one of the first bands that I ever got into at a young age. When I got into them, they only had 3 albums at the time, and it's definitely been pretty interesting to see how they've evolved over time. But this album, I'll always have a soft spot for this album, and of course the 2 albums that came out after it. But some of my favorites on here, of course, I do like the hits on here, like Just Like You, I Hate Everything About You, and Home. But some of my other favorites, I like Drown. I think that's maybe one of their most underrated songs. Wake Up is pretty good. I like Scared, and I think the album starts off in a fairly strong way with the song Burn. But yeah, overall, still really enjoy this album from 3 Days Grace. And again, one of their best albums. But anyways, those are my picks. Let me know if you can think of more great albums from 2003 that are in rock and metal. And do you agree with my picks? Are some of these albums that I picked some of your favorite albums from 2003? Let me know some of your favorite or least favorite albums from 2003 and all that good stuff. But anyways, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, like, subscribe. Have a nice day, and take care.